Wow, such a privilege to hear Josh and Carolyn's story, and it is amazing to see what Jesus has done in their lives. And if you're just joining us, we are in the final part of a series called This Is You, and we're talking about how Jesus wants to intersect with your story. And we're looking specifically at accounts in Scripture, historical accounts of Jesus intersecting with people's lives, and then also how he's intersecting with the lives of people who we know today. And what we're saying is the Jesus who changed lives thousands of years ago wants to change your life today. We truly believe that. And today we're talking a little bit about healing and about miracles. You just heard a story of Jesus showing up in people's lives, healing them, healing their marriage, healing their body. And you might be wondering to yourself, when you hear that, you might think, man, that gets me excited. Maybe you are a person who really believes that there's healing in the world. You believe there's miracles in the world. You maybe believe that God shows up in that way. I know at Connexus here, we truly believe that Jesus does bring healing to people's lives. But maybe when you hear that, you feel skeptical. And you know what? I totally understand that. Unfortunately, there are people in our world, often called pastors like me, who've taken advantage of people by doing things like fake healings in order to make money. We've seen them on television, on Dateline, on 2020. And I get that. I get where the skepticism comes from. Or maybe it just makes you angry when you hear about it. And the reason it makes you angry is because one day you prayed that someone would be healed. One day you prayed for a miracle and you feel like Jesus didn't show up in the midst of that. And that frustrates you. There is a mystery to it, but we truly believe that Jesus does heal people. And today, I'm going to share with you, if you come on a journey with me, about someone whose life was healed, who was healed, but God showed up in even a more powerful way than that. And at the end of this, I'm going to pray for you and pray with you that God would show up in your life in the same powerful way. Now, we're going to jump into this journey in John chapter 9, and wherever you're coming from faith-wise, there's something for you right off the top here today. We want to create a church where everyone is welcome. You can bring your doubts, you can bring your questions, that you can come and join us on the journey. And we're going to be looking at this journey of Jesus and a blind man who he heals in John chapter 9. And this is how it starts. It says, as Jesus was walking along, he saw a man who had been blind from birth. Now, I know it's early in the passage. I'm not going to stop at every verse, but I want to stop here. Jesus sees this man who is blind from birth. Actually, Jesus is on the road from one place to another. He's not actually at a destination, and he sees this blind man on the road. If you've been with us for the other weeks of the series, what I found really interesting that I hadn't actually put together until this week, that in every single case, Jesus is on the road. Jesus is on the road with the men who are walking to Emmaus. We did in week 1. In week 2, he's on the road and he sees Zacchaeus in the tree. And this time he's on the road as well. In all 3 cases, he's on the journey. And in all 3 cases, he sees them. He sees them. In the midst of a crowd, he notices them. He sees them. And while our whole time today isn't going to be spent on this, I think that there are some of you who are watching who need to know that God sees you. On the days that you're frustrated, on the days that you're discouraged, he sees you. When you're struggling with your kids, he sees you. When you're struggling in your marriage, he sees you. When you're struggling with an addiction, maybe it's alcohol or pornography or drugs, he sees you in the midst of that. He sees you through a lens of love. He's present with you. That wherever you are, the God of the universe sees you. That you're loved, that they're valued, that you're valued, that you know that he sees you right where you are. One of the things we see in common in all of the accounts we've looked at is that on the journey, and on the journey of your life, Jesus sees you. And he's present with you no matter how lonely you feel in the midst of your challenges or in the midst of your pain or in the midst of unknowns. He sees you. Now, what happens when he sees this blind man? What happens in his encounter? Well, let's look at it. And in verse 2, Rabbi, his disciples asked him, why was this man born blind? Was it because of his own sins or his parents' sins? Now, this is very typical in some ways of the disciples. They're walking on the road. There's this blind man on the side of the road. They see Jesus see him, and they don't ask a compassion question. They don't say, hey, how can we help him? Can we give him some money? They'd seen Jesus heal some other people. Jesus didn't heal everybody, but he healed some other people. And they didn't say, hey, could you heal this guy? They don't ask him any kind of question out of compassion. Their question is a theological question. Their question is one of, hey, help us to understand the theology of this. Who sinned? Is it his fault or his parents' fault? It's so interesting to me. I think as human beings, when we see pain, our immediate response is like this. Who's to blame? Who's to blame here? And then sometimes we think it's the parents to blame, or it's the sister to blame, or they have themselves to blame. Or in some cases, when we experience pain, we'll carry guilt. We'll blame ourselves. We think it's ours. It's our responsibility. Somehow we did something wrong. You know, who's to blame for all of this? I just think of a party that you leave. You know, you get in the car and you're driving home from a party, you're driving home from dinner, you're driving home from visiting your family, and you turn to one another and say, oh, you know, my sister's in debt again, you know. But it's her own fault. She makes the decisions that she makes. There's an immediate look for someone to blame. Well, you know why I am the way I am? Because of the way that my parents were. It's easy to blame. It's easy to look for guilt. It's easy to try to figure out who's responsible. As human beings, we're all looking for who's responsible. And often, like the disciples, we look to the past. Who from the past is responsible? Who from the past is responsible? It's not that those aren't real issues. We even heard that with Carolyn today, looking to the past to find what the issues are. But Jesus then looks to the future. Well, the disciples are looking to the past. Jesus is looking to the future. And this is what he says. He turns this whole thing upside down. He says, it was not because of his sins or his parents' sins. It's not because of his sins or his parents' sins. It's not either of those things. Why are you looking at who to blame? Why are you looking at the past? Jesus wants to look forward. And this is what Jesus says. He says, this happened so the power of God could be seen in him. Now, this is an important verse. This happened so that the power of God could be seen in him. What Jesus is saying is, I look ahead. I want to bring purpose to this pain. I want to see the power of God through this suffering. I want God to show up. Now, what he doesn't say is, I'm going to heal him. He doesn't say, well, you know, this is happening and I'm going to heal him. He doesn't say heal him. He says, this is happening, and part of it is that the power of God is now going to show up in his life. That I want God's power on display in his life. That the goal here ultimately is God's power on display. I want him to experience God's power in his life. But he doesn't say it's through healing initially. That's not the end goal. He's not worried about healing him for a moment. He's talking about his power on display in his life. I think so often, and it doesn't matter who you are, what your faith background is, if you've ever come to God and said, hey, I want you to heal this person, or if there is a God, I want you to show up in this way, or I want you to do this for me. We want God to show up in our moment in the way that we want him to. Hear this, in the way that we want him to, because we want him to relieve us. We look at him as sort of almost, it's a transaction. Hey, I'm coming to you, God, I'm praying, take this pain away. I'm coming to you, God, praying, take this suffering away. But that's not always his plan. That sometimes he wants to bring purpose in it. Sometimes he wants to put his power on display in a different way than we think he should. I was on a trip to Trinidad with a group of about 25 high school students a number of years ago. And we were serving at a children's home there over the course of a couple of weeks. And a family had heard that I was there at the children's home. And they lived just over an hour away. And they said, we would love for Pastor Jeff to pray for our son that he would be healed. And he was paralyzed from the neck down. And I said, yeah, I'd be happy to do that. So the son was in his early 20s, if I remember right, and they put him in the car. It took them a long time, long journey, get him in the car. There were some logistical issues. They got him to the children's home. And in my mind, what I was picturing is we're going to go under the shade of a tree in a quiet corner, and I'm going to pray over this young man. I'm going to pray for him in kind of a quiet spot. It's not abnormal for me to pray that God would heal people. Scripture instructs us to pray that God would heal people, and I've done it maybe even hundreds of times over my almost 20 years of full-time ministry. And I thought, okay, we'll find a nice spot and we'll pray that God would heal him. But that's not what happened. Somebody came and got me and said, hey, we're ready. We want you to come and pray for this young man. And what they did when I arrived there was they pulled their car up into a carport and they opened the passenger side where he was sitting. And they brought all the children from the children's home and all the students who were on the team with me and all of the children's home staff, and they all gathered around to see me pray that this young man would be healed. Now, there are two things going on in my heart in that moment. On one hand, I really, truly, I wanted to pray. I wanted this young man to walk. I wanted to see a sign of God showing up, and I was coming with so much faith. And I was also coming with so much pressure. Wow, I've never prayed for healing for someone with an audience before. Your office is in private with people or a small group of people. And I was like, okay, here we go. So I walked over and I prayed with all my might that this young man would be healed. I did. I truly did. And then I called over all the students. I said, I'm going to get all the students to pray. And the students were praying with all their hearts that God would work in this young man's life. And at the end of that prayer time, he didn't walk. And if I'm honest with you, I didn't even really know what to do with that. And so it was dinner. It was a dinner time afterwards, and so they were getting dinner ready, and everything kind of dissipated, and I was talking with the parents a little bit. And then there was the mom of the young man and the woman who oversaw the children's home standing there. And the woman who oversaw the children's home said to me, Jeff, that was so powerful. And to me, it didn't feel powerful at all. And I said, oh, well, tell me more. And she said, it was so powerful for the children in our children's home to see these teenagers praying to God, crying out to God. And they said it was just so moving. It just felt like God was really present and was such an example to these young kids in our children's home. In her mind, God's power was on display in a huge way. It just wasn't in the way that I'd expected. It just wasn't in the way that I'd anticipated. Now, as I said, I've prayed for healing for lots of people. And I would say that some of those people have been healed and some of those people have not. Physical healing, relational healing, spiritual healing. I've prayed with all kinds of people. But here's what I do know, is that time and time again, whether the healing happened in the way I thought, God's power showed up on display in their lives. I've prayed for healing for people who weren't healed, and I saw God's power on display in a huge way as they moved towards the end of their lives. In fact, I would say in their final days, God's power was on display in one of the most mighty ways that I've ever seen. As He walked with them, as they drew closer to Him, as they pointed people to Him. See, Jesus' goal isn't just a miracle in a moment. It's His power on display for a lifetime. And we're going to see that in this story. So where do you want to see God's power on display in your life? Where do you want to see Him show up in your life? It might not look the way you think it will look. But the end goal is that you will know His power in an incredible way. We're going to see more of that. I'll show you what happens with this man next. It says, then Jesus spit on the ground and we're in verse 6, and made mud with the saliva and spread the mud over the man's eyes. Okay? This is weird. I recognize that. We're going to get to that in a minute. He told him, go wash yourself in the pool of Siloam. Siloam means sent. So the man went and washed and came back seeing. Now, I've tried to picture this in my mind over the last couple of weeks, maybe 100 times. I've been thinking about this for a while now. You think about this man who is blind, probably has heard that Jesus has healed other people, probably has heard that before, so maybe has heard that, he's healed some blind people before. Maybe not. Can't see anything, can't see Jesus. All he sees is darkness. Well, the light of the world stands right in front of him. And then what he hears is, I think, how many times did Jesus have to spit in this dirt to turn it into mud? You just don't spit into a little bit of dirt and that makes mud. You would have to spit multiple times. Is he thinking, what is happening? All I hear is this spitting? Does Jesus give him warning? I don't know, or if he just puts it on his face, or does he say, hey, my spit-filled mud coming your way? I don't know, it doesn't say. But what Jesus does is he takes this mud full of his own bacteria, people would have seen, and he puts it on this guy's eye. He doesn't put it on his hands. He doesn't put it on his arm or his leg. He puts it right on his eyes where he's blind. Right on, to me, your face is like one of the most sort of sensitive parts of your body. He puts that on his face. And then says, go wash in the pool of Siloam. And historians, most of them agree that this pool is not close by. And Jesus didn't really actually even take him there, it sounds like. Sounds like he might have sent him with someone else. And he says, go to the pool and wash. And I just think of the humiliation, if I can use that word to describe it. I think that's the right word. The humiliation of having spit-filled mud on your eyes as you're walking through the streets, headed to the pool, being sent to the pool. I think there's just something so humbling about that. But it was out of sheer desperation for something to happen, for God to show up in some way, that he was willing to do the humble thing. I think that's true for all of us. That if we want God's power to show up in our lives, there's a step of the humility that must be taken. That a step of humility is the first thing that happens as we move towards God's power on display in our lives. And the problem with that for a lot of us is we don't like the process. That we want God's power, but we don't like the process. Well, God, I want your power in my life, but I'm not sure I want to humble myself. We saw an example of this humbling today. You see Josh and Carolyn in their story. You think of what would have happened when Josh had to come to Carolyn and say, hey, I can't bottle this up anymore. We got to figure this out. Are you willing to go to a counselor's office? And for Carolyn to humble herself and say, I'm willing to do it. I'll walk through the door of a counselor's office. To walk through that door and think about the fact that when you walk through the door, some stranger is going to hear all your mess. You're going to take all the mud, all that mud from your life, and you're going to put it out publicly, just like that blind man had it on his face for everyone to see. You're going to put it out publicly for that counselor to see, and you're going to try to work through all of that. And you might have missed it, but Carolyn says right in the midst of their story, we did the hard work. I did the hard work for 8 months, humbly putting themselves before God. I know that when Josh was struggling with his voice and he couldn't sing, there was a period of time in our church where he would play in the band even though he couldn't sing. And to see him do that, so humbling, playing his guitar in the background when normally he would be leading our church in singing, humbly playing in the background, hoping that God's power would show up on display in his life. I want you to think of where you want God to show up with his power on display in your life. And then I want you to think of what's the humbling step you need to take. It's a step of humility that begins the journey to God's power on display in your life. Maybe for you, it means admitting to your spouse that you've got an addiction, or admitting to a friend, you need to know I'm addicted to pornography. I need some help. I need to go see somebody. I'm addicted to alcohol. I need to go see somebody. I need to admit to a friend, I've been sleeping around, and I know that I shouldn't be. Maybe for you, it's going to your kids and asking forgiveness for something that happened, or the way you've treated them, or going to your parents and asking forgiveness for something that happened. And maybe it's something that happened this week, but maybe it's something that happened years and years ago. Maybe it's going to someone and saying, this happened, we've never talked about it, I need to say something. I need to get this out. Now, when I tell you that, you already are reluctant because you don't, it's going to change things. The secret's going to come out. We want the power of God, but we don't like the process. It's messy, it's muddy. But it's the first step to God showing up in his power in your life. What's amazing about that is God just doesn't want to show up in that moment. He wants to show up for a lifetime. One of the mistakes that people make with this passage is they preach up to here and then they stop. They'll read up to this point and they go, man, he was healed, that's awesome, and then they stop. But there's actually something more important in the story. God's power actually shows up in display in a more powerful way. You see what he's really after when you get to the end. So what happens, you see, is that the blind man throughout John 9, his neighbors can't believe what's happened, and they're asking him who did this, and he says, the man called Jesus. Then what happens is they take him to the religious leaders, and the religious leaders come to him and say, who did this? And he says, well, Jesus. And they're like, well, how can he do this? And the blind man says, maybe he's a prophet. So then the religious leaders go to his parents, and his parents say, we don't want to say anything. I mean, he's old enough to answer for himself. And then they come back to him, the religious leaders, and say, who is this Jesus? How could he do this? You say he's a prophet, but how? And he says, only someone who is God who could have done this. And the religious leaders are so upset that he would say that this human being, Jesus, was God, that they kick him out of the synagogue. And then Jesus finds him. And you see something incredible. It says, when Jesus heard in verse 35 what had happened, he found the man and asked him, do you believe in the Son of Man, the Son of God? Do you believe there's a Messiah? Do you believe there's a promised one? The man answered, who is he, sir? I want to believe in him. If you believe in him, I want to believe in him. Whoever he is, if he's the one giving you the power to heal my blindness, I want to follow that person. Who is he? You have seen him, Jesus said, and he is speaking to you. Yes, Lord, I believe, the man said, and he worshiped Jesus. It's interesting. What's happening here in this passage is way more powerful than him receiving his physical sight. Now he's receiving his spiritual sight. Now you see what Jesus really means. His power on display in his life wasn't about healing his eyes. It was about healing his heart. It was about a greater story, a story of heart healing. I would argue that at this point in the story, when he realizes that the person in front of him is the Messiah and he believes in him, he would trade his physical sight any day for the spiritual sight that he has in that moment. That I'm walking like the Son of God, that I'm standing with the Son of God, that this healing of my eyes is so small compared to the power of who this person is right in front of me. In fact, Jesus says this. He says, Jesus told him, I entered this world to render judgment, to give sight to the blind, and to show those who think they see that they are blind. I've come to seek those who need to have spiritual sight. I came to seek after those who need spiritual sight, to show them who I am. And there's going to be people who are cynical, and there's going to be people who are jaded, and there's going to be people like these religious leaders who question, who will remain blind. They think they can see, but they can't. But there are so many out there who need hope, who need light in darkness, who need to know that I'm the Son of God. There's one theologian that says that when this man was healed physically, It's like he was still in a dark room. Even though his eyes were healed, he still couldn't really see. And at the end, the light of the world lights up that room. And he sees who's really in front of him. Here's the thing. If you want to experience God's power on display in your life, it takes that step of humility. You need to remember, we need to remember, it's not about a miracle for a moment. We get so focused on I'm in my pain, get me out of my moment. But Jesus doesn't want to just meet us for a moment. He wants to meet us for a lifetime. It's not just about a circumstance. It's about a greater story. A story he wants to write of redemption. But the beginning of the process is that step of humility. It's that step of humility. What's the step you need to take? You need to go to your boss and tell him, hey, I need to be honest with you. I've been taking advantage of my workplace here. I haven't been working like I've said I'm working. Maybe you need to apologize to an employee. Maybe you need to speak to a partner. Maybe you need to speak to your spouse and tell them about the secret stuff going on in your life that needs to come out, that needs to be dealt with. You need to make an appointment with the counselor. You need to ask forgiveness of your kids. You need to make that phone call. Whatever it is, when you take that step of humility, it will be messy. There may be consequences, but on the other side is spiritual sight. On the other side is God showing up and with his power on display in the midst of your pain. There'll be purpose in your pain. His power will be on display. And you'll see him in a way that you've never seen him before. So what I want to do today is I want to pray for you. Now you might be someone who says, I'm not even sure I believe in God. What I love about this is God shows up in the man's life. Jesus shows up in his man's life and heals him. He heals him before he even recognizes that he is the Son of God. So if you're not sure that Jesus is the Son of God and you're not even sure about the God thing, this is for you too. This is for everyone. Take that humble step. And maybe for you that step is for the very first time, I'm going to admit that maybe there is a God. Will you show up in power in my life? Take that step towards wherever you want him to show up in power. And at the end of the day, it won't just be physical sight, it's spiritual sight that will be the gift. That is what the end is that he has in mind. His power on display in your life. So I'm going to pray for you now as you think of what that step might be on the road to seeing God show up in an incredible way. Let's pray together. God, we come to you and I just pray for all of those who already know, oh man, this is the step I need to take. I know the process is going to be messy, but at the end of the day, I want the power of God on display in my life. I pray you give them courage. Courage today, tomorrow, to pick up that phone, to schedule that meeting, to take that step, to call that counselor, whatever it might be. Knowing that you're going to show up on the other side. Knowing that you're going to walk with them through it. Knowing at the end that you are going to open their eyes even more spiritually. That they might see you show up and know that you are the Son of God. We pray this in your name. Amen.